Art is only art if it helps to change people, to move them forward. The Bauhaus. Those who founded it, those who represented it, knew how to merge life and art and life within us. The Bauhaus, forever. The Bauhaus, that was an idea, more an ideal. No difference between draftsmen and artists, everyone together in a new community. We would build the cathedral of the future. I wanted to be part of it, and something that freed us. We did not learn to paint, but learned to see anew, to think anew, and at the same time, we learned to know ourselves. Those are two quotes by Irina Bluhova and Ray Soupault, two female students from the Bauhaus in Weimar, Germany. So I've been meaning to do an episode about the Bauhaus, which is so central to the aesthetics of the Weimar Republic. And originally I thought I would focus on the founders and the amazing instructors of the school, who were all incredible artists and architects and pedagogues in their own right. But I stumbled upon a wonderful book about the lives of the female students of the Bauhaus. And I honestly have had trouble finding good readable histories about women in the Weimar Republic, so I thought this would be a better way to start discussing the school. So this episode is about 5 women whose lives were changed by the Bauhaus, what it brought them, and the struggles they had there. Welcome to the Weimar Spectacle, where I explore the brief and extraordinary life of the Weimar Republic. My name is Bremner Fletcher Duthie. I am a singer, actor, and theater maker, and I spent years performing songs in theater from the Weimar period, and I am inspired and possibly more than just a little bit obsessed by that particular moment in time. If you want to see the images for this episode, go to my website. I really recommend this one, or just because the art is incredible, the images that these people, the art these people made was extraordinary, and just they are such amazing creatures of the 1920s with their incredible haircuts and outfits and clothes. They just look so great. So if you go to bremnersings.com, BREMNERSINGS.com, and just click on the Weimar podcast link, you'll get to eventually the link to this particular episode. And so, as you know, my big absurd idea for all of these podcasts is that the Weimar Republic invented everything about the modern world, and for better or worse, we are still dealing with the possibilities and problems it gave to us. And to prove this possibly and probably and more than likely completely unprovable idea, I will be exploring the arts, the politics, the science, the architecture, the social innovations of the Weimar period, and of course, the terrible and irresistible rise of the Nazi Party. So the Bauhaus was founded in 1919 by the architect Walter Gropius, and it had a sweeping mission. It was going to unify arts, craft, and industry and break down the old hierarchies between fine art and applied art. The Bauhaus encouraged its students to learn by making, by experimenting with materials, and by blurring the line between art and their own life. At the core of its early philosophy was a man named Johannes Itten, a painter and a teacher, and he believed that creativity required harmony between body, mind, and spirit. Students in his classes often performed physical warm-ups before beginning their work. It was almost a ritual to connect the inner energy with their exterior artistic practice. Itten's courses placed enormous value on experimentation with materials, the raw materials, the wood, the textiles, the metal, the glass, allowing students to discover how form, color, and texture interacted. His famous preliminary course encouraged students to break free from all old academic traditions and instead learn by doing, by touching, by testing. His students began the day with exercises in movement and breathing and meditation. He introduced non-Western philosophies, vegetarian diets, and ultimately the belief that the artist's inner life was as important as their outward product. It was a radical new approach to arts education. Although Itten's mystical and spiritual approach eventually clashed with Walter Gropius's more pragmatic, industry-orientated vision, his influence remained. It was a belief ongoing in the Bauhaus that artistic education should engage the whole person and that the study of multiple materials and crafts could unlock unexpected creativity. Students trained in his philosophy came away with a deep respect for experimentation and for the expressive qualities of raw materials. And I think for the women who studied there, these lessons would shape their ambitions and their careers and their lives. So, while at the beginning the Bauhaus opened its doors to women and declared themselves completely committed to ideals like equality, those ideals were still under pressure from the 1920s social assumptions about women's ability and role. Gropius himself, in the founding statute, made statements like, "There will be no difference between the beautiful and the strong sex, absolute equality, but also absolute equality of obligations." So already in that statement, there's a certain amount of social assumptions going on. And in practice, the number of women admitted and the workshops they entered were regulated. From quite early on, female students were often, quotation marks, guided into weaving, bookbinding, and ceramics, considered to be women's worlds, even when some of those women expressed more interest and ability in painting, architecture, or metalwork. Today we'll focus on 5 women: Friedel Dicker, Lou Schepper Birkenkamp, Margareta Heyman Lobenstein, Marianne Brandt, and Margareta Reichardt. We'll explore what drew them to the Bauhaus, how their ambitions shifted within its walls, and how their lives carried those Bauhaus ideals into the world. The book that I'm drawing from is called Bauhaus Women by Elizabeth Otto and Patrick Rossler. I actually feel kind of traumatized about having to pick only 5 stories from the book, since there are about 45 lives in the book, and they are all extraordinary sketches of complex lives. After they left the Bauhaus, most of them went on to take the Bauhaus ideals into very long lives, but unfortunately, beside each name, there is a small box with dates of their births and deaths, and it was often difficult to work my way through the book, turning pages and quickly glancing at those dates and seeing how many of them ended in the early 1940s, and knowing that those particular amazing women must have died in one of the concentration camps. Let's start with one of those stories. Friedel Dicker arrived at the Bauhaus in 1919 as part of its founding class. Born in Vienna in 1898 into a lower-middle-class Jewish family, she had already trained in photography and printmaking. What attracted her to the Bauhaus was the promise that walls between disciplines would be torn down and an artist could try her hand at anything. Before she arrived at the Bauhaus, she had already studied composition with Arnold Schoenberg and performed street theater with puppets, so she was a committed artist. Itten, one of the people who gave the founding principles to the Bauhaus, with his blend of mysticism and rigor, appealed wildly to Friedel, who was searching not just for craft, but also for a way of living her life. She embraced his teachings, practiced his breathing and meditation exercise, and explored his theories of color and form. Her versatility was remarkable. She seemed to thrive on crossing boundaries, which was the entire point of the Bauhaus. In workshops, she experimented with bookbinding, stage design, textiles, architecture, painting, and costume design. She also was a very committed political activist. She eventually joined the Communist Party and created art that opposed fascism and capitalism. She said, quote, "If you don't like this world, then you'll just have to change it." After leaving Weimar in 1923, leaving the Bauhaus, she continued her work in Vienna, collaborating with fellow Bauhaus student Franz Singer. Together, they established a studio that produced innovative interior decoration, furniture, and also stage sets. And they also together had a romantic and political partnership, both of them drawn to left-wing causes and both of them committing their design work to belief in social progress. Unfortunately, again, with the possibly because of the social conditions of the time, possibly because of outright sexism. There is evidence that many works from their joint atelier were only published under his name, even when her influence was substantial. Dicker also created, and I'll put one of these on the website because they're extraordinary. She created a series of photo montages, which was a kind of intricate photo collage that was so popular among avant-garde artists at the time, artists like John Hartfield or many of the Dadaists. All of her work, all of Dicker's work, are deeply anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, anti-war, and incredibly creative. The rise of fascism in the 1930s completely upended her career and changed the direction of her life. As a Jewish woman and an outspoken leftist, she was doubly vulnerable. Tragically, despite having a visa to immigrate, she decided to stay with her husband, who had been denied a visa. Eventually, she was deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp in 1942. And the Theresienstadt camp was a very odd place. It was literally set up as a showcase, if I can use the word, a model concentration camp where the Nazis brought artists and cultural workers and gave them some possibilities to explore their talent and their art, and then they brought in visiting officials to try and pretend that this was as bad as the concentration camps could be. In the camp, Dicker, instead of giving into despair, she actually returned. She used her Bauhaus training. She gathered all the children and gave art classes. And we can see from their quotes that these classes were more than just creative play. They were actually acts of survival for the children, ways of holding on to identity and to hope. One student later wrote, quote, "We didn't illustrate the misery and horror that surrounded us, but rather a different world that Friedel transported us to. She painted flowers and had us paint what we imagined we'd see looking out the windows. There was only a big table with painting supplies, and the paper was sometimes just waste paper or packing paper from some old packages, but at these moments, I felt like a free human being." Finally, and again very tragically, Dicker actually asked to be deported to Auschwitz in the hope of rejoining her husband who had already been sent there. However, before she left, she hid a suitcase of 5,000 drawings by her students in the attic of their dormitory, and these were discovered after the war, and in a way, these, along with her art, remain a legacy of her dedication and love. However, before she left, she hid a suitcase of 5,000 drawings by her students in the attic of their dormitory. And these were discovered after the war, and in a way, these are her legacy of her art. At the Bauhaus, she had learned to see design as a path to inner harmony. In Theresienstadt, that training became something else entirely, a tool of resistance, a gift to the next generation. She was murdered in Auschwitz in 1944, but her legacy endures in the thousands of children's drawings preserved from Theresienstadt, each one a testament to her belief in the power of art. Next, let's talk about Lou Schepper, later Lou Schepper Birkenkamp. She enrolled at the Bauhaus in 1920. Originally, she had wanted to study medicine or languages, but her art teacher, Margaret Schall, noticed her talent in color and painting and encouraged her to apply to the Bauhaus. When Lou entered the Bauhaus in 1920, she already had a painter's eye and a keen interest in the new visual languages emerging in modern Europe. Unlike many of her female peers who were directed into the weaving workshop, Lou insisted on pursuing painting and color design. She worked closely with figures like Paul Klee, one of the instructors, and her understanding of color relationships shows the influence of both Klee and Itten's theories of color. Paul Klee in particular, became a lasting influence on her, encouraging her to think of color as a living force capable of transforming mood and meaning. She also absorbed Itten's systematic approach to color harmonies, but where Itten sought spiritual order in color harmonies, Lou's ambitions were practical. She wanted to use color as an architectural tool. I love this quote by her about the spirit of the Bauhaus teachings. She says, quote, rather balance on wisps of air than sit on dogmas. Lou's work is filled with invention and delight. Magicians, jugglers, angels, fantastic animals, and strange creatures fill up her paintings. At the Bauhaus, she met Hinnerk Schepper, a fellow student who specialized in wall painting and color design, and their personal and professional lives soon intertwined. They married in 1925, and for much of her career, Lou worked alongside her husband. Together, they developed large-scale color plans for buildings, applying bold palettes to exteriors and interiors in a way that made modern architecture more human, more alive. Lou went on to become a leading figure in color design for architecture, particularly in the years after the Bauhaus closed. She collaborated with her husband on large-scale color projects, bringing Bauhaus ideas about color into the practical world of building interiors and exteriors in large-scale constructions that were happening across Germany at the time, trying to house the many, many workers in the country. In Berlin during the 1920s and early 30s, Lou's career blossomed. She worked on housing estates, that's the word I was looking for, in public buildings, pioneering what we might now call color consultancy. She believed that color should not be a mere afterthought in architecture, but a structural element, something that shaped how people experience space in their daily lives. Her later career in Berlin involved teaching and developing theories of color planning that bridged art and everyday architecture. In a sense, she embodied one of the Bauhaus's key mission, which was to make artistic knowledge serve society directly. And her contribution to architectural color design was pioneering. She remained active in promoting Bauhaus ideas long after the school was closed by the Nazis. Her husband died in 1957, so their partnership obviously ended, but Lou carried on teaching, writing, and lecturing about color, and she participated in enormous projects like the design of the German National Museum, the Berlin Philharmonic, and the Berlin Airport. Her later career was dedicated to keeping Bauhaus principles alive, ensuring that a younger generation understood the importance of integrating color into design in a way that human beings could experience it directly, experience space, and live among colors that would help them become better people. She also designed stage costumes, sets, contributed to the stage workshop under Oskar Schlemmer, and when she died in 1976, she was working on the color design of the National Library in Berlin. Next, let's talk about Margaret Heymann, who was born in Cologne in 1899. She was already trained in applied arts and saw in the Bauhaus an opportunity to combine artistic innovation and mass production. She took the basic courses in 1920, and in the ceramics workshop, she embraced that with extraordinary determination, plunging herself into new creations and new ways of working with the material and industry. But in 1922, she stormed out of the Bauhaus because she was denied a permanent place in the ceramics department, and instead they tried to force her into the bookbinding department. And when she left, she obviously was not content at all. There is a note in the archives that says, quote, "To the Secretariat, Miss Heymann left our department on November 2nd. She broke the windows into pieces. The room had to be cleaned," end quote. So Margaret took her ambition and her Bauhaus training, and in 1923, she founded the Heil Workshops for Artistic Ceramics near Berlin, one of the earliest independent businesses launched by a Bauhaus-trained woman. Her designs were bold, geometric, and brightly colored. I'll put them on the website. They're extraordinary. They're everything you think of when you think of 1920s Weimar design. And again, that reflection of the Bauhaus vocabulary of form and function always melding together. They emphasize the clarity of shape and a suitability for use in modern living, modern 1920s living, but I think they still look incredibly modern. They're striking with bold geometric forms, vivid glazes, and shapes that were functional yet striking and beautiful and scream out, we are no longer in the 19th century. She wanted her particular ceramics to be affordable, to reach middle-class homes, to democratize modernist tastes like so many other of the Bauhaus students. And as you can see from the pictures, as you hopefully will see from the pictures either on my site or Google them, they're just gorgeous. I would be delighted to have these things in my home today. Her workshop, her factory grew quickly, employing dozens of workers and exporting internationally, and she was a very rare individual, a Jewish woman at the head of a successful industrial enterprise in 1920s Germany. She married Gustav Lobenstein, and later her partnership with his brother Gerhard. They worked together, they lived together, they expanded the business together, although Margaret was always the creative driving force. And then, once again, the rise of the Nazis shattered everything. As a Jewish entrepreneur, she was forced to sell and abandon her factory in 1933. She was forced to sell it at a price so low that after the war, the German government stepped in to compensate her. But in 1934, a local paper wrote, quote, "The great purification begins. The company finally has a new master. Women and men have begun to work under the symbols of the German Labor Front." And the symbol of the German Labor Front was a huge round gear with a swastika in the middle of it. Margaret fled to Britain. Her husband had died in a car accident, so she was alone, managing the business and her young children. In Britain, she attempted to reestablish herself, but the British market, she never achieved the same recognition she had enjoyed in Germany. She had entered the Bauhaus with a vision of uniting craft and industry. She had fought for it. She had achieved it brilliantly, only to have it stripped away by politics and persecution. Next, let's talk about Margareta Reichardt. She was born in the town of Erfurt in 1907, so quite a few years after the other women we've been looking at. And she joined the Bauhaus in 1926. By this point, she had already completed 4 years at a local school of applied arts, so she had a lot of training. And from the beginning, her ambition was incredibly practical. She wanted to master textile design, which was where a lot of the women in the Bauhaus were either directed or directly sent, and she wanted to see her textile designs enter everyday use through industrial manufacturing. Her career reflects both the limitations women faced at the Bauhaus, where they were often funneled into feminine disciplines, but yet I think it also reflects the opportunities they seized within those boundaries, transforming those disciplines into a central pillar of modern design. At the Bauhaus, she then learned weaving as both art and science. Students were trained to investigate new materials, new fabrics, to discuss possibilities with industry, to do cost-benefit analysis of new designs and materials. Under the teacher's guidance, the workshop became a place where women transformed constraints into creativity, and the weaving workshop was run by a woman. They experimented with synthetic fibers, industrial looms, and new patterns. Margareta embraced this incredibly experimental spirit, but always kept her eye on functionality, and her designs balanced bold geometric patterns with the needs of mass production. However, we can also see her involvement in protests within the Bauhaus weaving community. She, along with others, criticized the conditions, especially as the weaving workshop was shifted by the leadership of the Bauhaus towards fulfilling industrial contracts and making money to keep the Bauhaus afloat. One piece of her work is a collage titled Sie brauchen das Bauhaus, in which she used textile swatches, Goethe verses, and a pointed commentary, Erzung am Fließband, education on the assembly line, and tempo, speed, emphasizing the demands for speed and industrial time pressures. And she included a tuchtigen Webmeister, a strict male foreman pointing to a clock. She left the Bauhaus in 1931 and returned to Erfurt, the town of Erfurt, where she set up her own weaving workshop. There she continued the Bauhaus mission, fusing art and industry. She produced textiles for curtains, upholstery, and clothing, everyday items that bore the mark of modernist design. In the more than 50 years that she ran her own business, most of her creative work lay in designing and producing materials for everyday use and in decorative fabrics, including clothing and home textiles. She also created these stunning wall tapestries, focusing on images of gardens and nature and literature and music. Amazingly, these large tapestries were mostly created directly by her on a hand loom without any pattern. During the Nazi period, her opportunities were limited, yet she managed to keep working. She wasn't Jewish. She wasn't inappropriately, didn't have an inappropriate large company. And again, in weaving, I think the Nazis were relatively happy when women were working in, quote, traditional women's crafts. And also she focused on traditional German designs or neutral designs that could pass under the radar of the Nazi censorship. After the war, she resumed her teaching and her workshop activities, training younger generations in the same principles she had absorbed at the Bauhaus. She never became a household name, but her career embodied the continuity of Bauhaus ideals. The belief that textiles, so often dismissed as, quote, women's work, could carry modernist design into the heart of ordinary life. And again, I'll put some pictures of her work on the website or look her up because some of those big tapestries are just amazing. Next, let's talk about the extraordinary life of Marianne Brandt, who broke some of the barriers women usually faced in the Bauhaus. She was born in 1893 in Chemnitz, Germany. She came from an upper-middle-class family, her father a lawyer who appreciated theater and fine arts, and Brandt's early training was in painting and sculpture. She intended, like many of the students at the school from very early age, that art was going to be her path. She studied at private art schools and at the Grand Ducal Saxon College of Fine Art in Weimar before she went to the Bauhaus. But in 1923 or 24, she was irresistibly drawn to that institution. She writes, quote, "I was drawn to Bauhaus almost magically," end quote. She decided to commit herself so much to this new ethos, to this new way of making art, that she burnt all of her previous works. She saw in the Bauhaus a chance to move beyond expressionist painting, which she'd been doing, into design as craft, technique, form, and function. And when she arrived in the metalwork workshop, which turned out to be her great love and her great commitment, she, of course, confronted massive prejudice. Metalwork was dominated by men and was considered a man's realm, and the idea of a woman working there was completely resisted, even in the Bauhaus. She later recalled, quote, "At first I was not accepted with pleasure. There was no place for a woman in a metal workshop. They admitted this to me later on and meanwhile expressed their displeasure by giving me all sorts of dull, dreary work. How many little hemispheres did I most patiently hammer out of brittle new silver, thinking that that was the way it had to be, and all beginnings are hard," end quote. However, she was the only woman to be permitted to continue in the metal workshop, and her mentor, Maholi Nagy, was instrumental in recognizing her potential. He encouraged her and supported her, and some of her most famous design pieces date from those student years. There's a beautiful object called a tea infuser, sometimes called the MT49 teapot. I'm not totally clear what the difference between a teapot and a tea infuser is. They seem like they're saying the same thing, but all the literature seems to think that they're very different. And she also made coffee and tea services, lamps and ashtrays, all showing a mastery of geometric forms, sleek line, and a functional aesthetic. Functional in the sense that they could be used, they were usable, and also they could be produced easily. In 1926, after the Bauhaus moved from Weimar to the city of Dessau, Brandt became Mitarbeiter in the metal workshop. the only woman to take that kind of responsibility, essentially kind of a teacher or a semi-instructor. And by 1928, she was actually the acting head of the metal workshop. She negotiated industry contracts, lighting fixtures, lamps, etc. So her role wasn't just artistic, but organizational, technical, industrial. And she, in the new iconic building, which you might have seen pictures of, and if you haven't, I'll put a picture up on the site, she designed most of the metal fixtures used in that new building. And as homes around Germany were increasingly being modernized and had need for things like desk lamps and hanging electric lights, she designed fixtures like that, and they started to appear across the country. Of course, her career, like many others, was affected by the changing politics. After 1933, she was less able to maintain her presence in the design industry. Everyone who had been taught at the Bauhaus, which was seen as a modernist, non-national socialist school, was suspect by the Nazis. She worked as a designer, teacher, artist, but never, ever again in her life did she manage to get the same kind of institutional power, institutional visibility for her work. So I think you can see in her life strengths of the Bauhaus system. There was access to all these incredible materials and this training and theory and industry, and a chance, although rare, for a woman to cross into a male-dominated zone, which certainly would not have been possible in the more traditional schools around Germany. And her designs remain completely iconic. The MT49 tea infuser, or as maybe everybody else in the world says, teapot, the lighting objects, the household objects that combine beauty and utility. And she also did experiments in photography and photomontage that, again, show an interest in many different disciplines and also a willingness to try new techniques in every single discipline. So the Bauhaus, that's a little way into it through some of the women who were involved. And it sounds like a very complex place. Radical ideas, learning by doing, studying multiple crafts, the unity of art and life, equality. At least in the founding documents, they stated their equality, yet still it was riddled with contradictions, which maybe all artistic places are, artistic rivalries, power structures. Walter Gropius declared it open to men and women alike, but in practice, the women were funneled into certain workshops, told that their place was in weaving or ceramics rather than architecture or metal. However, within those confines, women like Friedel Dicker, Lou, Schepper, Birkenkamp, Margaret, Heyman, Lobenstein, Margareta Reichhardt, and Marion Brandt forged extraordinary paths. Their ambitions shifted as they navigated the realities of what was possible at the Bauhaus and also the insane, turbulent world that came after it. And some, like Dicker, carried the Bauhaus methods of art and design into actual acts of resistance, whether those were designing posters and typography for communist magazines, or whether, like Dicker, simply giving lessons to children in a concentration camp. Others, like Heyman, turned craft into a thriving industry. Schepper Birkenkamp transformed color into an architectural language and did that work throughout her entire long life. Reichhardt quietly wove modernism into fabric. The Bauhaus gave them, I think, the confidence in experimentation, respect for materials, and the conviction that art and life were totally inseparable. And although Weimar Germany was a progressive place, women still faced social, political, institutional barriers. And so this education at the Bauhaus, for all its problems and for all its sexism, I think at least reading these 45 lives seems to have been transformative. It gave these women the opportunity to develop skills, artistic voices, and careers they would not have had elsewhere. And as I said, even when pushed into so-called, quote, feminine crafts, they expanded those crafts until they became modern design. And I think they sensed and directly went up against those limitations that were imposed on them and used their creativity to critique, to expand, and to fight against, and sometimes win battles against those limitations. I highly recommend the book Bauhaus Women, and not just for the history of the Bauhaus and its impact, but also the book gives a clear view of the impact of the disaster of the Nazi rise and the Second World War and all its horrors on ordinary lives lived. The writers chronicle about 45 women's lives, and well, for one thing, it reminds me that if people have a chance to live, well, they live long and complex lives full of strange and sometimes beautiful and tragic choices. So it's sort of life-affirming in that sense, because you look at your own life and sometimes you wonder about the choices you made. So reading 45 snapshots of different lives really opens you up to the many possibilities. However, it also allows us to see the fracturing over and over again of these particular lives at this particular era by the events in Europe. And actually, it's been kind of a intense, brutal thought exercise to imagine how all those lives of these beautiful, amazing, talented women would have progressed had it not been for those events. The art they would have made, the choices that would have been available to them, the way they might have changed the world, the possibilities and beauty that we today might have inherited from them if they'd had a chance to live out those possibilities and make that art. So once again, if some of the concerns and desires in these stories seem familiar, well, they should, because I believe the Weimar Republic helped give birth to the modern world. Thank you so much for listening. Hit subscribe or follow if you want to know when the next episode appears. I have a busy performance life, so it's really random when the shows come out, but I do try and make one a month, and then sometimes I don't for several months, but I have so much to talk about, so they'll be out there eventually. And I don't have any advertising budget for the show. I don't have any budget at all. I have no idea how you actually would advertise a podcast, but I'm sure there is some magic high budget way to do that. However, I am literally standing in a closet surrounded by old clothes trying to repurpose a beautiful old microphone that I have to get a good sound. So if you leave a review on your app or hit a star button, it encourages the podcast to be found. It encourages the algorithm thingy to send it out to new people. Or you could just mention it at a party. Old school. That would also be great. I hope you join me in the coming months as I explore more about the strange birth, life, and death of an experiment in creating a new society. I will put images for this episode onto my website, bremnersings.com, BREMNERSINGS.com. And who, I ask, am I to discuss Weimar? Well, I am no academic, I am no sociologist, I am no political scientist or historian. I am just I am an obsessive artist, a singer, playwright, and cabaret performer who has been obsessed with the arts and the music and the architecture and the style and the clothes and the haircuts and the cool outfits of the Weimar Republic all my life. I've recorded 3 albums dedicated to the music of this time, and particularly the music of Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht. If you want to listen to them, just search for Bremner Fletcher Duffy in any music streaming site, and you will find all my albums. And if you want to know more about my work, see the images from the period, or maybe suggest a specific Weimar subject that obsesses you for an episode, check out bremnersings.com, BREMNERSINGS.com. Thank you very much. Join me next time for another walk through the amazing creative madness of 1920s Germany.